because we serve the entire kingdom here at Vanderbloemen. We work with churches, we work with Christian nonprofits, we work in education, Christian secondary schools and higher education, and then parachurch ministries. The list goes on, but all different types of Christian organizations. And so we have asked Jay to just infuse your wisdom into our VanderLive series today about crisis management. But before we get started with that, Jay, well, first of all, for you guys, I would love for you to comment below where you're joining us from today. Let us know. We've got Fanuel behind the camera there. Say hey, Fanuel.
Hi, Fanuel.
So we'd love to see, where you're joining us from today. And while you're doing that, I'm going to have Jay just kind of give us some background on your role here at Vanderbloemen.
Well, I've been with Vanderbloemen for almost 9 years. So I started at the end of 2010. We were just a tiny little organization back then, and then I think you came just a couple of years later.
Yeah.
And lots changed around here since then, including where we sit right now. But prior to that, and I've loved my time here. It's been fantastic, and looking forward to many years of serving. But before that, I was a pastor for about 13 years, and was an executive pastor of a large church out in California, and then served in a faith-based for-profit media company for about 8 years before coming here. And so, but since I've been here, I've worked with pretty much every kind of church you can think of, every kind of organization you can think of, large, small, in between, different parts of the country. It's been a lot of fun.
And what Jay will not tell you is that he personally, here at Vanderbloemen, has completed over 250 searches or staffing assignments. So whether that's helping one of our clients find their key leader or doing succession planning, that's one area that Jay specializes in, is pastoral or senior leadership succession planning, or even just organizational chart consulting. Sometimes we have clients that are like, hey, we know we need to hire somebody, but we have no idea who that is. And so Jay's able to go in and help them figure that out. And that's one of the things that I really love about your experience, Jay. And I've had the joy of working with you now for 7 years, which is so fun and cool.
It's amazing.
It really is. It's just your perspective, because you have sat in that executive pastor chair at a large church, but you've also been on the business side serving nonprofit organizations.
Right.
In Christian media. And so I just love that you bring both of those perspectives, to your job, helping different organizations.
God doesn't waste anything. So all the things that I've done in my life somehow have led me to be able to do this, which has been awesome.
That's so true. I love that. God doesn't waste anything. That's really good perspective, especially if somebody's out there watching this who's on the job search today. I feel like that's probably a really encouraging insight.
Oh yeah, absolutely, because you never know what has led you to what's going to be next.
Absolutely. All right, well, let's dive into crisis management. So the first thing that I want to talk about is when we say crisis management, to you, Jay, like, what does that umbrella of a crisis mean? What are we talking about?
Well, it's anything that will disrupt the life of your organization. So if I think the thing we think of most of all is, the loss of a pastor suddenly. That's probably the most common thing we face when we're asked to come in. It's our pastor has left us either by choice or not by choice, and it's sometimes very suddenly. We've experienced the death of a pastor that we've been invited into. We've seen a pastor get released unexpectedly, or just leave, kind of drop everything and go. So that's the one thing we think of most. But other things are, the departure of a key staff person suddenly, when someone gets fired and people get up in arms about that and we don't know why. And sometimes there's stuff that happens, may have been a moral failure of some kind, and that throws a lot of things up in the air because people don't know how to handle that, because they want to operate with grace, but they also want to operate with truth, and they can't figure out what's the balance of that. And so that's what people think of mostly. But there are other things as well. These days you have to think about like active shooter scenarios, and that may happen in your church or in your community. Right now, as we sit here in beautiful Houston, not too far away in Louisiana, there's a hurricane bearing down, and that means that's a community-wide crisis that churches need to be able to respond to. We had to face that when we were here during the Harvey scenario.
Yeah.
So embezzlement, financial fiduciary issues. You can kind of go on and on, but the crises, hit. Sometimes it's a sudden crisis. Someone has a medical emergency in a service. That has happened, and are you prepared for something like that? So what counts as a crisis is anything that sort of upsets the day-to-day workings of your church or organization.
Absolutely. And I love that you defined it as an unexpected departure, because exactly what you just said, I mean, that can look like a lot of different things. It can be someone, a senior leader, leaving suddenly just because he's tired. And that doesn't mean that, maybe there wasn't a moral failure involved, but it could be a crisis for the church, because if it's a church of 100 to 200, even up to 500, that's a big disruption into the everyday life and rhythms of the church.
And sometimes more so when it's a smaller setting, because they're doing everything, and when that person who's doing everything is no longer there, who does that?
Absolutely.
And nobody really knows, because no one's ever done that before. So it's a challenge.
Absolutely. A couple other scenarios I can think of that we've seen at our time here at Vanderbloemen is when there's a church where a pastor has maybe had a sickness for a really long time.
Yes.
And that's a really hard and difficult situation to walk through. Or embezzlement, or other moral failure, sexual misconduct. Unfortunately, that's something that the church across denominations and theological affiliations are really dealing with right now. It's a big topic of conversation, as it should be. We need to know how to prevent these things from happening, and then what do we do when it does happen?
Right. We do live in a fallen world. That's a reality that we are faced with every day as we work with churches, because we're working with people, and people are fallen. There's a reason why Jesus came and died for us, because we really needed a Savior. And the reality is, the kingdom's already here, but it's not yet. And so we're dealing with that all the time.
Absolutely. Well, if you're just joining us, this is our VanderLive, our summer series, where I, Holly Tate, VP of Business Development here at Vanderbloemen, are visiting with our consultants to talk about issues that you are facing as pastors and church leaders, maybe even nonprofit or education leaders in the Christian space. And so today I'm joined with Jay Mitchell, our Senior Executive Search Consultant, and we're talking about crisis management. So, Jay, one of the things that we just talked about was the sudden departure of that senior pastor or a key leader in the church. So, what is the number one mistake that you see churches make when this happens, the mistake that they could have prevented this from happening? Tell us about that.
That is the biggest mistake. And I do a number of succession consulting and opportunities. So I go into a church and we'll talk about how do you plan for succession. And what I'll almost inevitably find is that had something happen to the senior leader unexpectedly, like they hadn't brought up the succession plan, there was no plan in place for who would step in and preach the following week, or if something happened, if they got hit by a bus, or if just something unexpected happened, they got pulled away, or their flight back from vacation didn't happen. They had no plan in place. And so the mistake usually is not when the crisis happens, although plenty of mistakes happen after that. It's having not had that emergency plan in place. So we always say, create an emergency envelope. So there's a list of things, like if this happens, here's who the person we contact, here's who steps into the pulpit, here's who takes over these responsibilities that previously the person who was there was doing, and work your way down. And then beyond that, what's the communication plan and all of that. So the first one is not having planned in advance. The second one is not having a communication strategy in place for handling those kinds of things.
Why do you think it is so uncommon for churches to not have an emergency succession plan?
It's the same reason why people don't have a will. It's denial.
That's a great point.
We don't anticipate that's going to happen to us. I had a friend that's my age just passed away yesterday, and totally surprised, unexpected, healthy, didn't see it at all. I'm assuming he had a will, but I'm thinking, maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But none of us expected it.
Yeah.
So it's that same thing happens in life, but we don't expect it to happen. Therefore, we don't make the plan, and so we're caught off guard. And so it's denial, it's assumptions, it's we'll get to it, eventually. So we always encourage. In fact, one of the recommendations we almost always make in every succession report I've done is if you have not already created one, have one in place.
Yeah.
So.
So let's unpack that a little bit. You just went through them really quickly, but what's second nature for you? I feel like I'm like, slow down. Like even I want to take notes. So let's unpack what should be in that emergency succession plan.
Well, it begins with, you should do this for all of your staff members. So it's not just the senior leader. If you've got a children's pastor, imagine your children's pastor who doesn't show up on a Sunday morning when you've got dozens, maybe hundreds of volunteers ready to go, and there's no one there to direct them. Same thing with student ministry. So do this with all your staff members, and that's one of the things we recommend. But then, what should be in that? Really, a couple of things. One is, who is the point person to step into that role? Has someone been cross-trained into doing that? So if it's a senior pastor, is there someone who is capable on your staff already to step in to preach?
Yeah.
If you don't have a staff person, is there a lay leader who could step in on short notice to preach? Is there a friend in the community that you could say, hey, would you be available if something ever happened to step in and serve with us for a short time? So those are, so that's the who. Who steps in. Then there's the what. What are they doing? If it's preaching, how many times are they scheduled to preach? Do we need to start scheduling guest preachers? And who's going to be responsible for that? But what is the job? If it's a children's pastor, if it's a student pastor, if it's the business administrator, who's been cross-trained to step into the what of what they're doing? I know around here, like in our organization, we've been very intentional about cross-training all of our administrative staff specifically, so that if someone steps out, even for vacation, we don't miss a beat.
Yes.
We do the same thing with our research team that's sitting right out here. I mean, we had a guy from our team that hadn't been back to see his family in 10 years. Josh Lai, who went back to Malaysia to visit with his family, and so he created a whole plan, and we had it back, and we never missed a beat because we knew it was coming, and he planned ahead for it. But if he just suddenly, we've had people who gotten sick unexpectedly or had family crises, and so we had to quick. You have to be able to be quick on your feet, but to have a plan in place already, it helps you know what's the next step.
Yeah. So, okay, quick recap, because I don't know if you guys are taking notes. I'm taking notes. So, if you are planning your emergency succession plan, which you all should, and one thing that you just said, Jay, which is so crucial, is you should be doing this at every level. So we call succession at every level. So not just your key person, but the children's pastor, the youth pastor, the associate pastor, the executive pastor, like, oh man, the knowledge that executive pastor has in their brain, that if something were to happen, that would be really bad if it's not put anywhere. So the who is going to be that point person to really step in and execute the what.
Right.
So make sure that who and that what is documented in that succession plan at every level. So
absolutely,
that's key.
I think the other thing that you didn't ask, but mistakes that churches or organizations make, particularly churches, I think.
Yeah.
When that happens, let's take specifically the issue of a moral failure. What typically happens is that person wanders off into the dark recesses of life, trying to get their life together, and they are all alone. So one of the things that happens with a congregation who have a deep love and affection for this person is like, what are we doing for them? They're hurt, they're angry, but there's also a group of people who are like, what are we doing to care for this person? And more importantly, I think, or maybe as importantly, is their family. Because it's not just in a church setting, particularly, the individual who made the moral error.
Yeah.
We feel like, well, they should be punished, but who of us hasn't experienced something we needed grace for?
Sure.
But then think about their family, because that's their whole support system and network, and that nobody knows how to care for them. So to have a plan in place that doesn't have to be public or anything, but to have an idea in place of how are we going to care for the folks who are most impacted by what has happened. If it's the death, how do we care for that family? If it's a moral failure, how do we care for the family? And then how do we care for the wider family? What are some things we need to do to communicate to the congregation about what's happened? And they want to know, everybody wants to know.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
Yeah.
So that's great. A couple quick recaps. So one, we talked about you've got to have that emergency succession plan, and if you don't have that, get off this Facebook Live and go start working. Just kidding. Please finish this Facebook Live. But then go work on it. Put it on your calendar. Talk with your board. Plan that emergency succession plan at every level. And then secondly, as a part of that plan, have a way for you to care for that employee or staff member's family. So Jay, I want to unpack that a little bit. What are some, because that sounds, wonderful, but what are some things that churches need to do to really make sure that happens? What are some practical ways they can care for the family?
Well, presence is like we typically would say in any pastoral situation, is being present with them. There's going to be a tendency, and let's take it out of the moral failure conversation, because
Sure.
I think that's more complicated. We can come back to it.
Okay.
But let's say something happened to their family, a family member, maybe a spouse passed away, a child has a severe medical issue, or the pastor themselves maybe passed away or is severely limited. We're good at pastoral care when it comes to congregation members, generally speaking, not always, but generally. But when it comes to the pastor themselves, we don't know what to do, because they're the person who's supposed to be doing the caring.
Yes, that's a great point.
So who goes to that person and comes alongside them? Who listens to the spouse or the children? Having your children's pastor available, or children's director available to talk with the kids and pastor those kids. Having somebody who can come alongside the spouse and just be a presence. I think the ministry of presence is probably the most important. The other thing that a lot of churches don't think about, and this goes with the emergency succession plan, is financially. When someone steps out of ministry or is injured or dies on the job, sure, we may have a disability insurance plan in place, things like that, but a lot of times families have not planned for long term. Certainly the spouse. And so a lot of churches haven't done the financial work, getting insurance, making sure they have the right insurance policies in place, that the family can be cared for financially. And one of the things that you'll discover is that the congregation always knows. And so when they realize that the family is not being cared for, people are going to leave. And so to know that your pastor's family is going to be cared for, whether it's a moral failure or some kind of health issue or even death, that there's been a plan in place for taking care of that family, and it creates a sense like, well, we really are a family. We really are doing the work of Jesus here.
I love that, because it's not just about building the plan, but it's budgeting for the plan.
Right.
Because if that crisis happens, you can have a plan all day, but if you haven't budgeted for it in the organizational budget, then it's not going to get done if the resources aren't there.
Yeah, and to piggyback on that, one of the things when we think about the emergency plan is we always suggest set aside, figure out if your pastor was incapacitated for 3 months. Let's just say 3 months. So that's 12 weeks of preaching, and you don't have an associate, or you don't have the people on staff who could step in and do that for the next 12 weeks. Well, maybe you have to budget, half of those times need to be a guest preacher. Well, do we have money set aside that we could actually pay someone to come in and preach the gospel, preach the word, while the pastoral team is doing the work of pastoring?
That's a great point.
So having that sort of reserved budget to think through, how are we caring for people? How do we take care of the things that have to happen just in the routine of ministry?
Absolutely. And I do want to circle back. I know it's really complicated and even very heavy, but I do want to circle back to when there is that moral failure situation. What are some really practical ways that you've seen some of our clients care for not only the individual, but also the family?
Many times there's counseling provided. So they'll, sometimes it's other pastors who will step in and be sort of that restorative group for the individual, sending them away to a retreat center. There's a great retreat center in Colorado that many people have gone to, but all around the country there are these places where you specifically designed to care for pastors in ministry who've gone through some sort of moral issue, moral failure. So providing that for them. Again, there's always the sense like, well, they screwed up, if you will. I mean, they made a mistake, so they're going to have to pay for it. But was it systemic? Was it something we could have prevented? Was it burnout? I mean, there's a whole bunch of reasons that go, not to excuse it, but let's make sure they get restored. I think that's the redemptive message of the cross, is that the worst thing in history that ever happened became the opportunity for life to happen for all of us. And so if the worst thing that could happen maybe in a church happens, what's the redemptive possibility? How can we bring healing and health to the individual, to the family, and ultimately to the kingdom, who is going to be served well by a pastor who maybe has fallen but has been redeemed, much as Peter was, and you go on and on and on throughout the scriptures about how God has used broken people to serve in his kingdom. And I think the church has an opportunity that oftentimes it misses because it hasn't responded in a way that's healthy or grace-filled.
Absolutely. Wow. I feel like we could just end it right there. That was so good. And then, Jay, I want to take that one step further because there's a lot of organizations out there, whether it's different. We actually have a partner that's called the Church Lawyers, who are lawyers who serve churches specifically. So there's a lot of organizations out there that talk about crisis management, et cetera. But one area where I don't see them talk about a lot that I think is really important, especially with the landscape right now where we're seeing a lot of sexual misconduct accusations and churches are confused and hurt and there's just a lot of brokenness there. What should churches do as far as crisis management goes in caring for the victim in a situation?
Absolutely.
This is really hard.
It's really hard. And what you notice is that, and it's just human nature, right? It goes to, why do we make an emergency plan? We prefer not to think about it. So we're dealing with a victim. And a lot of times what's happening goes very much behind the curtain that nobody can see what's going on. And some of that's legal protection, but some of it's just self-protection. So, and so people don't know what's happening. And so the victim feels very much unheard, uncared for, not listened to, and sometimes it's doubted, questioned whether or not it actually happened. And sometimes you can't really tell because there's no witnesses, and so you're taking, she said, he said, whatever. So taking it seriously, doing a thorough investigation, not sweeping it under the rug. If it's public, if the word gets out, letting it be public and communicating publicly about what's being done. I think that's where churches and organizations have failed pretty miserably over the years, is that things that happen that people know about and are talking about are not addressed from the front, and they begin to they lose trust in leadership. I think people, you don't say everything, but you have to say something. So that's where this communication plan comes into place. So you have to be able to say, there's this happened. Here's what happened. Not everything, but enough that that can be publicly shared. It doesn't, not all the dirty details. Here's what we're doing about it. Here are the steps that we're taking. Admit we haven't fully figured it out yet, so we're in process, and we'll continue to communicate with you. That typically happens in a worship service. Sometimes it happens via an email that goes out, probably a combination of both. Not on Facebook, not publicly. Although putting something, if there is something that is, like our pastor has passed away, here's what we're doing. Put that on your website so that people can go there and find out what's going on. And here's our plan to take our next steps. But when it's something that like this sensitive, but revisit it. Don't let it dominate your service. We always, think it brings a pretty heavy weight to it, but sometimes you take too long, and the longer you take to communicate something, the more likely it is you're going to say something you wish you hadn't said. But if you kind of brush over it in just a couple of sentences, people think, well, they're not taking this seriously. So how do you do it? You have to find that sort of happy middle ground. In a worship service, you're not there to talk about the body. You're here to talk about Jesus and his redemption and worship the Lord. But this is also family time, so we're going to communicate that. And imagine you're a guest who shows up, and this is your first Sunday, and you find out there's this thing that happened. The bad side of that is they find out you're human and that things happen, but the good thing that can happen is when they see a church or a body handling some hard things with integrity, with openness, with authenticity, but without being buried by them. I mean, they'll come back and they'll be like, I've seen it happen where people say, I love the way they handled it and I want to keep. This is a body I want to be a part of. So, but it does require thought, prayer, conversation, a plan. I mean, it's not just, I see guys like me who are used to talking publicly, and we think, well, we can just go out there and wing it. I'm going to spend 5 minutes talking about this thing that happened and not give it the kind of thought that I should, and I'm going to end up saying something I wish I hadn't said or not said it the way I wanted to. So we say, when you're going to, write it down, pass it around, here's what I'm going to say, just like we would a press release, make sure what we're saying, what we want to say is not going to be misunderstood, and then go over it again, so you're very clear about what you are saying as well as what you're not going to say.
That's so wise, Jay. And I've heard some of our consultants also say that when we're not intentional about our communication plan, people are left to make up their own stories.
That's exactly right.
And that's where you get a lot of the messiness, is when the church hasn't taken the proactive, intentional approach to handle it. I love what you said, with integrity. And to just make sure that there is a communication plan, because otherwise people are left to make up their own stories, and sometimes that story can be a lot worse than what actually happened.
Yeah, and we think we're protecting. That's part of it. We want to. We're protecting the victim. In some cases, we need to. We're protecting the family of the person who caused whatever it is that happened. In a sense, we're protecting the body. But we all know, like we've all been in families where there's been a secret that everybody, it's unspoken, but everybody knows it, and how dysfunctional that can be. So it does require a lot of thought and prayer and conversation. And don't try and figure it out on your own if you don't know. There are people out there who can help work through those crisis management. We get called pretty frequently when something happens. It's because we're sort of known out there as somebody who care for pastors. We'll get a phone call. William gets calls pretty much all the time. Saying, hey, this is going on, can we talk through this, help me figure this out? And so we're available to have those conversations. There are other organizations as well that are very much available and willing to help.
Absolutely. And I think just what you said, Jay, at the beginning, to have that emergency succession plan in place before the crisis happens, same with your communication plan. Have the communication plan now before something bad happens, so that then you know exactly what to do. And I also just want to affirm what you just said, to seek a partner who can walk alongside you, whether that's us from a staffing perspective and a succession planning perspective. We'd love to do that. Or one of our partners, like the church lawyers who are there to walk with churches from a legal counsel standpoint. Right. That's really, really important. So make sure that you're talking to legal counsel when a crisis happens. That's so wise. Well, Faniel, I'm going to turn it back over to you. So let's see if we have any questions that came in. I know we had some that folks wrote in before our Facebook Live, but wanted to see if anybody had questions during our Facebook Live today as well.
Yeah, so one of the questions we've received is, as a staff member, whenever a major crisis like this happens, what should I do? And then to add on to that, as a church member, a major crisis like this happens, what should I do?
A great question. Well, let's talk about the church member first, because I know least about that, so I can talk about it pretty briefly. Trust, but verify, I think, is probably a safe way of saying it. You don't want to just have blind trust in your leadership, but assume and believe the best about your church. A lot of times people jump to conclusions. There isn't enough information out there. So again, as Holly just said, we make our own judgments, and then we start talking. Don't stop the gossip train as quickly as you can. Be supportive. Ask, how can I help? Not why did this happen? Those are the kinds of things. And then step in, because there are going to be needs that are going to have that are going to come up that a layperson who's serving in the church can step in. So let's say if something happens to the children's pastor, how can I help? Something happens to the senior pastor, is there something I can do? Anything I can do, even if it's stepping in to be a receptionist for the day, or just anything at all. So I would say, how can I help, and not pass on any uncertain information that you don't know about. I think when it comes to the staff member, it's similar. It's how can I help? Hopefully the emergency plan has been in place, and therefore they know what their job is. I think one of the questions that comes up when something like that happens is, am I going to have a job, right? Because it's natural for us to go wow, my senior pastor left, something happened, there's going to be a big turnover, we're going to maybe have some financial implications, what's going to happen, and what about me is sort of a normal and natural response. But try and hold that one back a little bit. You can ask the question, but then move on to, what can I do? How can I serve? What's needed? And then who do I talk to about how I can step in and help? So those are just a few things that come to mind.
That's great. The only thing I was going to add was to that church member, one mistake that I see a lot of church members make that are very well-meaning is step in a pretty aggressive way with a lot of accusations. And what I would just encourage church members or lay leaders to to realize, and I'm one, I'm not on a church staff, but I am a lay leader, to go, we don't always have all the information. And I love what you said, to say, how can I support and not be divisive? We've seen way too many churches split over just one or two people who were very angry and didn't have all the information and had gossip meetings and split the church over it. And so I would just reiterate what you said, to try to be supportive and helpful, and get all of that information as much as is owed to you, because it's maybe not even owed to you, all of the information, so that you don't divide the church.
Yeah, I think something that came to mind there is that to recognize, as we're talking about crisis management, there is the crisis moment, the next, let's say 24 hours, 48 hours, week, 2 weeks, where you're in crisis mode. And everybody wants it to be fixed and over in a week, 2 weeks. How are we going to fix this? Because we all want it to be fixed because we don't like feeling bad. But to recognize that when something like this happens, whatever the situation is, sudden death, moral failure, crisis in the church, accusations that are made, financial issues that have come up, fiduciary mismanagement. That's not going to didn't start overnight, didn't happen overnight, it's not going to get resolved overnight. So people have to have, I think, an enormous amount of patience and willingness and grace to know this is going to be a process to find healing from that. And let the healing take place over time and not force healing too quickly.
Yeah, that's great. Daniel, do we have any other questions from today's Facebook Live?
Yeah, okay. Has Vanderbloemen faced a situation where the pastor transitioned due to an illness? So have we seen a situation where the pastor had to transition slowly or pretty immediately due to a terminal illness?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, we've actually seen this a few times. I will say most of the time we unfortunately get the call after the pastor has passed away after the terminal illness. We have seen a couple of emergency succession plans where we have a client where the executive pastor and lead pastor were actually on a run together, and the lead pastor had a heart attack right there and passed away. What a traumatic, I cannot even imagine. And we were there to walk through the church after that happened. But from a terminal illness standpoint, unfortunately, I see churches a lot of times wait until it's too late. And I think there's a lot of denial that's a part of that. But I think there's a way that you can have that plan in place and really gracefully walk with the pastor and their family to put a plan together to make sure that they're financially, emotionally, and spiritually supported. That's going to help them walk through that really difficult situation, and then also prepare the church for long-term health as well.
Yeah, and I think a corollary to that question, which I just recently came back, I'm doing a succession plan conversation with a church, and the pastor's spouse was wrestling with cancer and was doing fine, and then had sort of a real difficult season where they had to drop everything and go to another place and have some treatment. And so fortunately the church had already made a plan, and so the associate pastor stepped up, other pastors stepped up, and so stepping out of ministry for a couple of months was really not a non-issue. The church just gave him a sabbatical, just said, just to go take care of your spouse, we'll continue to pay you, and this is not going to go way against anything else. So they've done a good job of caring for them, and that was already in place prior to this tragedy happening. But you do see a lot where that doesn't happen to the pastor, but their spouse or their child. And then how are we, giving them the latitude and freedom they need to pastor their family and not have to pastor the church? To think through those kinds of things in a way that's going to be really helpful and redemptive.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jay, for joining us today on our VanderLive summer series. We really appreciate your time, and thank you for all that you do to serve our amazing clients all over the country. And for you guys, if you're watching this, maybe you missed the live session, but it's going to be up on Facebook. So if you're watching this and you have questions, we would love to get those questions. Just comment below. And also let us know what you want to hear from us as we continue this VanderLive series all summer, where we're going to be coming to you with the wisdom of our consultants to hear about how we can better build ourselves, build our teams, and ultimately build our churches and the kingdom.